speculation that you could actually have a train that has this kind of an axle problem that isn't discovered until the very last minute when it's too late.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
Last week, there was a horrible accident in East Palestine, Ohio. To my knowledge, it hasn't yet claimed any lives, which we are very, very thankful for. But it has caused a lot of damage and made an entire community so unsafe that it is illegal for residents to go home, because for residents that are within a certain proximity of the accident to go home, because the chemicals that were on this train are so hazardous. It's made all the more horrible because this was entirely predictable and avoidable. It's so predictable, in fact, that multiple railroaders have predicted that incidents like this will happen on multiple outlets. Working People with Maximilian Alvarez, he talked to a railroader, Jay, who described an incident, a hypothetical incident eerily similar to this one. There was a More Perfect Union video from back in December where a veteran railroader at a protest in DC again described a situation eerily similar to this one because they knew what the rail companies were doing to the industry, were doing to regulations, what they were doing to their workers, and they could see what was coming down the tracks. So we wanted to get somebody on to discuss this, and today we're joined by veteran railroader with 40 years in the industry. He is a past local and regional officer for the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen, which is a Teamsters affiliate, and he's currently a representative for the Railroad Workers United, an inter-union cross-craft solidarity caucus of railroad workers. Fritz Edler. Fritz, thanks for taking the time to talk to us this morning.
Well, thank you for having us on. And appreciate the Valley Labor Report because it's incidents like this and the general problem on the rails that is going to require regular people all across the country to raise these issues because unfortunately, up to this point, railroaders themselves using their vehicles and whatnot have not been able to get enough of a voice. It's all about stakeholdership, representation of railroad workers and the communities that are affected. So thank you very much. And
Absolutely.
Let's talk about this.
Yeah, well, so let's just start off with kind of a description of what's happened. How did this derailment happen?
Well, so from what we can tell, and these are evolving matters, of course, from what we can tell at this point, the train, which was made up on the 3rd of February down close to St. Louis, was headed to Conway, Pennsylvania. In the course of the route, it had a few problems, but the critical one was when a car in the middle of the train developed a problem with an axle. And this is a very classic railroad defect that is very dangerous. It's actually the cause of a great many derailments and wrecks. And this basically what happens is, as you can imagine, the axle and wheel are supposed to turn. If things interfere with it turning mechanically, then it can actually create a problem up to and including melting down so that essentially the axle disappears functionally. So at this point, this is what we think is the immediate, what they call approximate cause. The big problem going forward is not just to find out why it was that was allowed to happen, but what are the root problems that come before that. And that's really the critical thing, because there's a tradition in the Class 1 railroads of, they find the proximate cause, they find some individuals, they punish those individuals, and then they never have to address the policies.
Mm-hmm. And it was a concerning amount of time before the public even found out exactly what this train was carrying, right?
Yeah, and of course, this gets back to the critical crucial question of how the train is run. So in this case, the train had, fortunately for everyone concerned, this train had a crew of 3. Normally it would have been just 2, an engineer and a conductor, but they also had a trainee. So the fact that they had the crew that had the capacity to do things like separate the locomotive power, pull it away from the wrecked train to prevent further problems, but to be there on the site with their expertise and their knowledge of the consist and their ability to interact with the situation, that was a key thing. However, it took them a while, took the responders a while and the authorities a while to figure out exactly what they were dealing with, partly because of fire. And so again, the key thing here is that they were able to determine fairly quickly what the consist was, but then the question was, where are the dangerous products and what's happening with them? The original instruction to the public was to shelter in place. There's a big question about whether that was the best response at the time, but there'll be a thorough investigation by the National Transportation Safety Board that'll report on these things. We just have to keep the pressure on them to make sure that a full public inquiry is made regarding this matter, and that all of the contributing factors, including the trying to avoid scheduled maintenance, the question of why the defect wasn't found earlier, because this is a ridiculous situation that you could actually have a train that has this kind of an axle problem that isn't discovered until the very last minute when it's too late.
Right. And this, and this train was carrying, what was it, chlorine?
It had various products. 20 of the 150 cars were hazmat cars. 10 of those 20 were involved in the 50 cars that actually came off the rails and tumbled. The critical ones, the ones that are getting the attention, is called vinyl chloride. It's a component in manufacture of plastics. It's a particularly dangerous chemical. And in this case, one of the results was when they finally ended up having to use a small explosive device to release pressure in some of these cars, they actually released byproducts, which were phosgene gas and hydrogen chlorine gas, into the atmosphere. Phosgene gas, for those who don't know, is a World War I trench warfare gas. These are dangerous things. There are things about the way that the train was maintained, the way that the wayside was maintained, the way that the train was blocked. All of these contributed to making the dangers worse than they would have had to have been.
And what does that kind of gas do? This actual literal weapon of war. What does that do when people make contact with it?
Unfortunately, that's beyond the scope of my expertise. I am hazmat certified, but what you basically do is you have reference materials to determine when you're figuring out, okay, this consist had this and this and this chemicals in it, and in this case, your big problem is fire. In this case, your big problem is air. In this case, it's explosion. In this case, the case we're talking about, the vinyl chloride has many bad aspects. And the real thing I would want to say, people can look up phosgene gas if they want to, but is that one of the things that happens in a hazmat wreck like this is that the intense heat of the fires actually produce brand new chemical components, toxic chemical components that weren't in the consist to start with. It's a chemical process, right? Mm-hmm. And those new toxic chemicals end up in the water and in the soil, and in some cases they're forever chemicals. This is one of the things we saw in the 2013 wreck in the town of Lac-Mégantic in Canada. So one of the things that the public has to do is they have to make sure that the authorities follow up on all of the byproducts of the disaster, not just the labeled ones on the tanks.
Right. And so It's still the case that people within a certain proximity are not allowed to go back home right now. Is that
Actually,
right?
I don't think that's true now. As to my knowledge, they were allowed to return, I want to say 2 nights ago.
Okay.
I believe it was 2 nights ago. And of course, there's still monitoring going on, and there have been some reports of detections and things like that, although they assure everyone still that they haven't reached the levels that are concerning. This is air quality we're talking about. So hopefully the monitors will be responsible to make sure that people know if it turns out that this is a problem that requires people to leave their homes again.
So, all this sounds bad, but, when I saw yesterday morning that Norfolk Southern said they would give a $25,000 check to the Ohio town where this happened. So, I mean, this is, that's basic.
Here's a story about that. So I referred to the Lac-Mégantic wreck from 2013 up in Quebec, which was a terrible event. It's not the same as the circumstances of this one, but in that case, 47 people in that town died immediately, and some more afterwards. But the reason I mention it is because one of the first things that happened after that wreck was representatives of unscrupulous law firms started showing up in town and signing people up, for claim processing, liability stuff and everything. So what's going on right now is that the corporation is doing everything that they can to limit their liability and their exposure, shall we say, to response from the public, try to get ahead of it, try to create some legal protections. And that's what this money that you're talking about is part of.
Which, let's just, so in case anybody listening on the radio didn't catch that sarcasm, $25,000 for this accident is obviously not enough. There's I think somebody divided that by resident and it would be $50, per resident in this town. So it's obviously, certainly not, and, this shouldn't have happened in the first place, right? But now that it has, that's $25,000 is not enough. But let's talk.
From a company that made $12 billion in profits last year is my understanding.
And how many, Fritz, do you know off the top of your head, and I should have had this number ready, but do you know off the top of your head how much money they've spent in stock buybacks recently?
I actually do not know that figure, but it's a big factor, and it is on all the class ones. All the class ones that practice are currently practicing the operating. This is across North America. What they call precision scheduled railroading. So, but it's a big number, and what's happening is that instead of spending the money on making a safe railroad, which we know how to do, that's one of the things that's key here, is that the railroaders, and there are people in the industry that know how to do these things safely. They know what needs to be done. They know the science, and they're not allowed to because the corporations are dominated by hedge fund operations that dictate that their big goal is to do stock buybacks.
Right. And so looking it up really quickly, Norfolk Southern announces new $10 billion stock buyback program. This was from March of 2022. So,
and over $2.3 billion in 2018.
Insane. And so that's just to illustrate they've got money to fix this. And so let's talk about some of the things that they could have done, some of the things that we could do to avoid this. And one of those, Fritz, as I understand, is that this train did not have what are called electronically controlled pneumatic brakes. Can you talk to us about those brakes and some of,
Sure enough.
Yeah.
This is the thing that the industry itself did a lot of the research on and initially started having a favorable approach to. They call them ECP brakes. And then as soon as it started to be discussed that maybe this would be something that would be mandated, they all backed away from it, and now they spend a significant amount of money lobbying and using their power, which is way more than anybody understands, to make sure that they didn't get a regulation requiring ECP brakes. So essentially, the way that all freight and passenger trains in the country run today is an extension of an early 20th century type of braking operation that involves they're pneumatically controlled by compressor on the locomotive, and the signal is carried throughout the train by the air pressure in the brake pipe that determines whether the brakes are on and whether the brakes are off. Now, this was a huge step forward in the early 20th century compared to how things were before. But today we have far better technology, and this is an example. So with ECP braking, the way it works is that there's actually electrically triggered braking devices on each individual car that we have the technology now that we can have each individual car act appropriately in the event of a braking situation. So in this situation, in the situation with this train, without ECP braking, one of the things that happens is, because the train parted in the middle at where the original problem with the axle is, causes the brake pipes to part. The brake pipe vents the atmosphere. There's an emergency application of the brakes. So for example, with the derailed cars, what you can see is that the first car that gets its brake applied is the first one where the brake is, and then the one behind it, and the one behind it, and the one behind it, and the one behind it. But what that means is that the heavy weight, and this train was blocked with the heaviest, 40% of its weight was in the last third of the train, is basically running up on a stopping car. So that's what creates a lot of the tumbling and stuff. But with ECP braking, you could actually have braking starting to happen at the rear, which would help to retard that momentum that's causing this jackknifing, tumbling thing. Now, if you look in back of me, the picture that you see right here is a derailment right in the middle of Washington, D.C., where I live. I had come back from Lac-Mégantic, a visit there that related to the 2013 wreck, on the night before May Day of 2016. And we got up that morning. This is what took place right in the middle of downtown DC, and it was essentially a very similar kind of a cause, which was a defect with a wheel axle. And what the point that needs to be made here, so this wreck didn't hurt anybody, etc., but it was just luck that it didn't kill many people. It was only a couple of car lengths away from an apartment building and all of the transportation infrastructure you can see there. And it did have caustic materials that drained into the soil and into the water. So the ECP braking, which was your original point, is one of the ways we can move away from the dynamics of 19th century railroading.
Yes, and the Lever News has some really good reporting about what the industry has done to try to fight some of these regulations, and they have some really good history about the way that the Lever News reported it is that the Obama administration did eventually issue a very narrow, some very narrow rules about ECP brakes on certain trains that were very narrowly defined, too narrowly defined. I think they said hazardous trains have to have ECP brakes, but that hazardous was so narrowly defined that even this train would not have fallen under that definition. But then in 2017, the Trump administration rescinded it, and the Lever News has reached out to the Buttigieg Department of Transportation, and the Department of Transportation has said they have no plans to reinstate even this narrow safety rule from the Obama era.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a scandal. This is a complete scandal because, as you already pointed out, it's not like they don't have the money.
Right.
And the science is there. The evidence is overwhelming that this would be a better, safer way. In my career, I ran high-speed trains that had ECP braking. And I can tell you personally, and there are others in the industry and in RWU who have worked equipment that had ECP braking that know that it's a better situation. So this is where our problem is, and it's going to require a public outcry, which is the reason why I hope your listeners will also keep their eyes and ears open about possibilities, opportunities to be able to talk about why we need to change this. What we really need to talk about, though, I mean, the ECP thing is very important, but we need to talk about precision scheduled railroading, and we need to talk about, for example, the labor strife of the fall that centered around the question of scheduling. All those things are part of what happened in Ohio. The other thing is that the railroads, including the Norfolk Southern, got rid of so many inspectors, and after they got rid of those inspectors, then they did everything to get authority to do fewer inspections. So what we know now is that that through the grapevine is that the NS is doing what they always do, which is to go around looking for individuals to blame, so that they can then, discipline those individuals and not address the policies that got us to this place.
Right.
Yeah. Well, the precision scheduled railroading, I mean, the ultimate thing of that is that it's making too few workers work too much. And illustrate for us how it is helpful to, you mentioned that this particular train had 3 people on it, which made it easier for them to respond and try to lessen the damage to the extent that they could, whereas it would have been harder if there were only 2 people. And the train companies now only want to have 1 person on these insanely long trains. And so how is it, I'm just a layman, why is it, asking this kind of rhetorically, why is it that having more people on the train is helpful? Let me make it very simple. If you only have 1 person on the train, the only thing that train can do is go forward or stop. That is it, period, final. So when the corporations say that this is what they're interested in, they're saying to you that out of the thousands and thousands of trains that we send out, that they would like to have them not able to back up, not able to decouple, not able to separate, not able to do any of those things, which leaves, so even for the layperson, you can imagine that if what needed to be done was to back up, or what needed to be done was to uncouple something, that you'd have to have 1 person controlling the locomotive and another person doing the cut lever on the ground, right? But if you have a single person there, there's no way that can be done. So imagine even the millions of more mundane examples, like your community is cut off from emergency services because there's a train across all of the road crossings, and they don't have the ability to cut the crossing. They can't, if there's a fire under a car, they can't uncouple stuff and move it away. There's single person crews can't do those things.
It's just disrespectful to the public.
It is. It's not just that. It's also very, very dangerous. Right. And this has been so. Back in 2015, I was part of some public hearings with the FRA on this question, and community after community, and senators and mayors and people from all across the country are in there testifying about the increasing number of problems that they're having at their crossings and their situations like that. But so far, the overwhelming power of these corporations, and we witnessed an aspect of that in this last round of bargaining, where they were able to get even the national administration to treat the dispute as if there was only one party to it, which were the railroad workers, and that they didn't have any rights to redress. So instead of addressing the cause of the redress, and that's still out there to be resolved.
Right.
But I should say that the PSR is not just a problem of not having enough people. That's a big part of it, but they also, because they're so interested in the operating ratio, they sell off equipment, they mothball locomotives, they get rid of hump yards, they sell real estate, all kinds of things that were assets that provided opportunities. There were tools that could be used to have safer operation, but it looked great on the next quarter's report.
Right.
That's something that's standing out to me is, and this is not a trend unique to the railroad industry, but it seems very egregious in the railroad industry, is that you have these capitalists just like strip mining their own capacity. And more or less sabotaging their own operations just to hit some numbers on the next quarter without any long-term thinking whatsoever about even their own efficiency in operations, much less worker safety and, public safety.
Yeah, well, so you hit on a good point here, this financial strip mining thing, which is something that the hedge funds have done in a lot of other industries, where they take a healthy company and they strip mine it financially by this process of stock buybacks, basically. In other words, so they invest enough in the industry to get their people on the board, their board votes for the policies that end up creating these situations with the buybacks, then they can take their money and leave. And they basically, what they do is they end up leaving the rotting hulk of what was once a good performing corporation of one kind or another, with saddled with the debt that they've transferred all around. Now that is a process that's still ongoing with the Class 1 railroads in North America. Some of them are starting to make some noises, like they're understanding that essentially these policies that looked so good at the time are actually making it impossible for them to function certainly in a safe way going forward.
Yeah. And so, I mentioned that you are, you're a veteran railroader. You've been a regional officer of your union, and now you're a representative for the Railroad Workers United, which is a broad cross-craft solidarity caucus of railroad workers. And so what are y'all, what is kind of y'all's 10-point plan, so to speak? I know that you don't have like a 10-point plan, but what is your proposal?
I'll tell you what, first of all, we try to make sure that everybody understands exactly what it is that precision schedule railroading does. It's not precision, it's not scheduled, and it's not railroading. And the second part, pertinent to this, there's lots to talk about, but is that what we now know is that the people who live in North America cannot depend on the Class 1 railroads as they are constituted to not only keep them safe, but also not to serve them, not to provide the transportation services that we need. So Railroad Workers United has joined with other groups like United Electrical Workers and an increasing number of others to say that, look, we have ample evidence across the century that we need the railroads to be operated in the public interest, because the carriers, they'll play the common carrier utility card when it suits them, and all the rest of the time they'll say, hey, this is private, keep out, don't tell us what to do, even though they continually take and take and take and take from the public patrimony. So Railroad Workers United calls for the public ownership of the railroads. You can go to railroadworkersunited.org. You can see our resolutions on this matter, also on the technical matters that we talked about earlier, like ECP brakes. So Railroad Workers United functions in the way that we've needed for 150 years, which is all the different people and all the different crafts on all the different railroads are all divided up in one way or another. Railroad Workers United works to get a voice for all of the stakeholders, all of including the public. All the stakeholders need to be heard. Kind of
like one big union, something like that.
We're not. Railroad Workers United is not a union.
Right,
we're all union. We're almost all, except for the ones that work on short line railroads that aren't organized. We're all members of unions, and we are active in our unions. But what we find is that that's insufficient.
Right.
That's not. And in my career, as I said, I've been a local and regional officer. And I know the ins and outs. I know how it all works. I know where the bodies are buried, and we need a Railroad Workers United. We need an organization of this kind in order to do the things that aren't otherwise being done. So speak up. And one of the problems, and this is a practical one, is that the culture on almost every Class 1 railroad is that people who are actively on the job working are afraid to speak up. In recent years, we were able to successfully get some whistleblower protections, but historically, people are victimized when they stand up and they tell about what's really going on behind the curtain. So that's another thing that we're in a position to do with Railroad Workers United, is to be able to talk openly about the things that are not represented at any of the tables. And the regulators are largely captured by the carriers. They largely are an adjunct to the carriers, what they want. And this is a dangerous situation. We've got to do something about it.
And, talking about the regulatory capture, I cannot fathom the position that Pete Buttigieg is putting himself into. I mean, this is a guy that obviously he's got ambitions, and, how is it that he thinks he's going to win a Democratic primary, much less a general election, when his tenure at the Department of Transportation is so lackluster? I mean, we're talking about breaking a rail strike. We're talking about not, not even instituting instituting this major accident a incredibly narrow Obama safety regulation, not even going beyond that, but just reinstituting a narrow. I mean, it's bizarre. But and I also wanted to for the public ownership of the rails, what you were mentioning there, I wanted to expand on that just a bit. We had a long conversation specifically about that with another member of Railroad Workers United, Paul Lindsay, and he pointed out to me that what y'all are calling for is not a public ownership of the rail companies, which is something that I would support and I would be fine with, but it's a little bit less. It's a little bit less than that, and it is literally an ownership of the rail roads. Just like the government owns the car roads, the government should own the railroads, because and this is something that maybe people don't know, the tracks themselves are not owned by the public, which is bizarre, which is really, really bizarre. It's
also pretty unusual in the world. In the world broadly, it's very weird that at least in a developed nation, that the infrastructure is just left in the hands of the private profiteers.
Right.
So now in Railroad Workers United, we're a diverse group. We have a number of different kinds of ideas about exactly what this notion of public control, public ownership is. But you've seen our resolution, and what we understand, the most important thing, which is something that people in this country have understood in the past, sometimes like World War I, is that you cannot count on the private boards of directors of the Class 1 railroads to do the right thing. So if we want the right thing done, we're going to have to take it over.
Yeah. Fritz Edler, veteran railroader, member representative of Railroad Workers United. Is there anything else that you think that you wanted to hit on before we let you go?
No, I would just say, please. I mean, the reason why this particular accident rose to the level that in public attention it did was because of the toxins and things like that. But as you look at the wreck picture behind me, for example, it wasn't the same way. Do we have to have people die? Do we have to have communities destroyed? Do we have to, in order to be able to stop this, pun accepted, whatever, stop this train, stop this process where the railroads are making, by policy, their properties less safe. And they're also making it a place where nobody wants to work. I mean, they admit now that they've gotten rid of too many people, but problem is it's pretty hard to hire a conductor when you tell them, first of all, you won't have any private life, and not only that, but we're trying to eliminate your job.
Right.
So they're struggling. One of the people on this particular wreck out in Ohio was a trainee. They're in the process of trying to get those people back because they desperately need them to just provide basic service. But so the railroads are making it a place where nobody's going to want to work, and that it's going to be every single day going forward an accumulated additional risk.
Fritz, thank you for taking the time.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate
really enjoyed it.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Yep.
So long.
All right, folks. That was Fritz Edler, veteran railroader, former local and regional officer of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineer and Trainmen, a Teamsters affiliate, and current representative for the Railroad Workers United, talking about the train derailment in Ohio.
Yeah, definitely send my solidarity and love and support to Railroad Workers United. RWU is doing fantastic work. I think Fritz really hit on it, that it's something that's, been long needed to have that kind of cross-craft solidarity, get the members from different unions talking to each other amongst themselves, and then, bringing in the public because we all have a stake here. Yep. And, I really appreciate him giving us some background on that, and certainly appreciate the work RWU is doing because I think a nationalization of the rails is absolutely a needed step.
It's when you say nationalization of the rails, I mean, he mentioned that they have some diverse views, and so
right,
maybe he was hinting at that he, kind of like me, thinks that it would also make sense to nationalize the companies themselves. But just setting that aside, their resolution calling for public ownership of the rails, of the tracks, is
common sense.
So common sense.
Yeah.
You would not allow UPS to own our interstate highway system.
Right.
Like, that just wouldn't make sense. That wouldn't make sense at all. So obviously the rails should be owned and operated by and for the public good. So obvious.
Yeah, I mean, because look at what we've seen over the years. We've seen the railroad companies monopolize the railroad industry. They have systemically weakened regulations by lobbying these crooked sellout politicians and bureaucrats. They have reduced their own staff by thousands, people that they need to have safe, efficient operations. They've deferred maintenance and capital investments, all while engaging in these massive stock buybacks.
Right.
They've worked with the Biden admin and both parties in Congress to prevent their own workers from engaging in their legal right to strike, their human right to strike. And this is all happening while these rail barons, just like they're, coming back from the 19th century, they're engorging themselves on these record profits while stripping their own operational capacity in a way that threatens the American people and the American economy, to say nothing of their own workforce. So it's just really disgusting.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.